Have you ever wondered why the most giving souls, the ones who seem to carry the weight of others with grace, so often grew up feeling invisible? Here's a truth that might stop you in your tracks. The empath you see today was once the child who was denied the basic right to say, "This is mine." The child who learned that being selfish meant being unlovable. And what if I told you this very wound is the hidden key Carl Jung left us in understanding the empath's fate? Because here's the shocking truth behind every empath's kindness is not just compassion, but a history of suppressed needs. Needs that were pushed so far into the shadow that the child had no choice but to become what others demanded. But here's the part nobody talks about: when a child is denied selfishness, they don't stop needing. They just stop asking. And in that silence, the empath is born. Carl Jung spent his life exploring the hidden architecture of the psyche, the masks we wear, the shadows we bury, the archetypes we live out without realizing. And his final insight into individuation, into becoming whole, reveals something breathtaking. The empath's greatest struggle is not giving too much, it is learning that they are allowed to take. Think about it. As children, we all go through phases of selfishness. The toddler who screams, "Mine." The child who refuses to share their toy. These moments are not flaws, they are vital steps in claiming a sense of self. But for many empaths, these natural phases were punished, shamed, or overwritten. Maybe their parents sighed in disappointment whenever they wanted something for themselves. Maybe love only came when they were agreeable, quiet, and selfless. Maybe anger or sadness was met with withdrawal instead of comfort. Slowly, the child learned, if I put myself first, I will lose love. If I want too much, I will be abandoned. If I am selfish, I am unworthy. So they gave, and gave, and gave. Wait until you hear this, because Jung warned that when parts of the self are repressed, they don't disappear. They sink into the shadow. And for the empath, the denied right to selfishness becomes a haunting presence in the unconscious. It whispers through exhaustion, through resentment, through the quiet ache of never feeling truly seen. The empath grows into adulthood skilled at reading others, anticipating needs, holding space. They become the healer, the listener, the peacekeeper. But underneath, the shadow stirs. Beneath the selflessness lies a buried hunger, the desire to be chosen, to be prioritized, to be loved without having to earn it. Here's where Jung's insight hits hard: the shadow cannot be denied forever. What is buried will rise. And if the empath does not integrate their denied selfishness, it returns in twisted forms. Maybe through burnout. Maybe through attracting partners who take endlessly. Maybe through sudden bursts of rage or withdrawal that feel out of character. But let me tell you a story. Sophia was known as the rock of her family. The one who sacrificed, who never complained, who always showed up. But inside, she carried a secret exhaustion. One day, after years of silence, she snapped at her partner over something small. The outburst shocked her. It wasn't who she believed herself to be. But Jung would say it was precisely who she had always been. Shadow finally demanding a voice. This next truth will shock you. The empath's journey is not about becoming more selfless. It is about reclaiming the selfishness they were never allowed to have. Not in a destructive way, but in the sacred sense of saying, I too deserve to exist. I too am allowed to want. Jung's concept of individuation is the process of becoming whole, of integrating both light and shadow. For the empath, individuation means welcoming back the parts they were told were unworthy, the anger, the desire, the selfishness. These are not enemies. They are missing pieces of the soul, but here's the paradox: when the empath reclaims their selfishness, they don't become cruel. They become balanced. Their giving is no longer a survival strategy, it becomes a choice. Their love is no longer rooted in fear of abandonment, it becomes authentic. Think of it like a river. When blocked, it floods one side, leaving the other barren. But when allowed to flow freely, both sides flourish. The empath's selfishness is not a blockage, it is the other bank of the river. Without it, the waters cannot find balance. And this is the part nobody talks about: the empath's light shines brightest not when they deny their needs, but when they embrace them. Because in doing so, they teach the world a radical truth: love is not just sacrifice. Love is also saying yes to oneself, but wait, what happens when an empath, who has spent their whole life denying selfishness, suddenly starts reclaiming it? How do others respond when the giver stops giving unconditionally? How does the narcissist react when their endless supply begins to dry up? Let me ask you something. Do you remember the first time you said no and meant it? Not the casual no when you didn't want dessert? Not the polite refusal of something small. I mean the real no, the one that drew a line in the sand, the one that risked disappointing someone you cared about. For the empath, this moment feels like a small death. Because deep down, their childhood conditioning whispers, if I say no, I lose love. Here's the truth, nobody talks about the empath's healing begins the first time they choose themselves, even at the risk of losing someone else. But here's the paradox. What feels like selfishness to the empath is often nothing more than basic human self-preservation. Saying no to an unfair request. Declining to be drained. Choosing rest over rescuing. Yet because their childhood wiring equated selfishness with rejection, even these simple boundaries feel dangerous. Carl Jung would say this is the shadow knocking at the door. The very parts of the self that were repressed as a child now return as an urgent demand. Let me live. Let me exist. But wait until you hear this, because the moment an empath says no, masks begin to shatter. Think of the narcissist, who has long depended on the empath's endless yes. To the narcissist, the empath's no feels like betrayal. Why? Because it interrupts the unspoken contract, I take. You give, that is who we are. When the empath dares to disrupt this contract, the narcissist scrambles, panics, lashes out. Because without the empath's compliance, the narcissist's illusion of control begins to collapse. Let's put this in a story. Eli spent years in a relationship where his partner demanded constant attention, validation, and care. He worked overtime not just at his job but in the relationship, soothing every mood, anticipating every need. Then one evening, exhausted, he said it, I can't do this tonight. I need time for myself. His partner exploded, accusing him of being cold, unloving, selfish. Eli almost caved, but something inside him held firm. For the first time, he realized her love was conditional on his silence. This is the moment Jung describes as the confrontation with the shadow. The empath, long identified with the persona of the giver, finally encounters the disowned part of themselves, the one who wants, the one who needs, the one who takes. And while the outside world may call it selfish, Jung reminds us, it is essential for wholeness. Here's the part nobody talks about. The empath's rebellion is rarely loud. It is often subtle. A quiet refusal, a delayed response, a boundary spoken softly. And yet these small acts carry seismic power. Because for someone who was conditioned never to take up space, even a whisper of self-assertion is revolutionary. But what happens next? The world tests them. Friends who benefited from their endless giving may pull away. Family may guilt them. Partners may accuse them of changing. And the empath feels torn between the old survival pattern of saying yes and the new path of claiming no. Wait until you hear this, the guilt the empath feels when reclaiming. Selfishness is not proof they are wrong. It is proof of how deeply the programming runs. Guilt is the ghost of the child who believed love had to be earned. Carl Jung believed. Individuation often begins with disobedience. The moment we stop living by the rules that were imposed on us and begin listening to the deeper call of the self. For the empath, that disobedience is the refusal to be endlessly selfless. Let me give you a metaphor. Imagine a bird that has been caged since birth. The cage is comfortable, safe, familiar. One day, the door is opened. The bird hesitates. Flying feels terrifying because the cage, though confining, was predictable. But the first step outside the cage is not destruction, it is liberation. The empath's no is that first flight, but here's the twist. When the empath begins reclaiming their selfishness, something unexpected happens. Their relationships may fall apart, but their sense of self begins to come together. They start to feel a strange energy, a vitality, a pulse of authenticity they had never known before. For the first time, they realize I exist, not just for others, but for myself. This next truth will shock you. The empath's selfishness, once reclaimed, becomes a form of love. Not just love for themselves, but love for the world. Why? Because only when you can give yourself love freely can you give to others without chains. The empath no longer gives to survive, they give because they choose to. And that choice is what makes their compassion powerful. But Jung warned, it is not enough to say no once. The shadow integration is a process. The empath must continue to practice selfishness in small, steady ways. Resting without guilt. Saying no without apology. Asking for what they want without shame. Every act of selfishness heals the inner child who was once denied. And let's not forget the narcissist, or any energy drainer, will resist this transformation. They will accuse, manipulate, guilt trip, anything to pull the empath back into submission. But this is precisely why the empath must hold firm. Every no is a thread cut from the web of control. So, what's the deeper truth here? Carl Jung's final insight is this: the empath's denied selfishness is not a flaw, but the missing piece of their soul. By reclaiming it, they do not lose compassion. They gain wholeness. And in that wholeness, they become unbreakable. But here's where it gets even more mysterious in the next part. We'll explore how the empath's denied selfishness is not just a personal wound, but a collective one. Because societies, families, and entire cultures depend on certain children being selfless to maintain their illusions. And when the empath breaks free, it doesn't just change their life, it destabilizes the systems that fed on their silence. Let me ask you something. What if your silence wasn't just about you? What if the very reason you were denied selfishness as a child wasn't because of who you were, but because the people around you needed you to play a role for them? A role that held their fragile world together. Here's the shocking truth: many empaths weren't just children in their families. They were the glue, the stabilizers, the peacekeepers. They were told, directly or indirectly, your needs can wait, because everyone else's chaos comes first. And in this way, entire family systems were built on the empath's quiet sacrifice. Carl Jung would call this a collective projection, the unconscious burden placed on one soul to carry what others refuse to face. The empath becomes the container, the vessel where everyone else's unmet needs, conflicts, and shadows are poured. But here's the part nobody talks about: societies need empaths the same way. Dysfunctional families do. In schools and workplaces and relationships, the empath is subtly positioned as the one who absorbs, who yields, who smooths the rough edges. And because they were denied selfishness early on, they adapt seamlessly to these roles. They become the invisible scaffolding holding up systems that would collapse if everyone claimed their own needs equally. Think of the golden child who learned perfection, or the caretaker who carried their parents' emotions. These are not accidents, they are archetypal roles within family systems. And the empath often becomes the caretaker archetype, sacrificing their selfhood to maintain the family's fragile balance. Wait. Until you hear this, the empath's denied selfishness is not just a wound, it's an assignment. A forced contract handed down by generations of unconsciousness. Parents who never integrated their own shadows pass the weight to their children. Cultures that glorify obedience and shame individuality demand compliance. The empath becomes the perfect fit for this role, precisely because they learned early on to silence their own voice. But let me tell you a story. Maya grew up in a household where her father raged, her mother withdrew, and her siblings scattered. From a young age, she learned that her calm voice could soothe her father's storms, that her patience could comfort her mother's silence. She became the quiet anchor no one thanked but everyone relied on. As an adult, she found herself playing the same role at work, covering for others, absorbing stress, smoothing conflicts. She thought this was just her nature. But Jung would say it wasn't nature, it was programming. A mask born of necessity. And here's the twist: when the empath finally breaks this role, the entire system shakes. The family resists. The workplace resists. The narcissist resists. Why? Because their survival once depended on the empath's silence. The empath saying, "I choose me," doesn't just liberate one person, it threatens the equilibrium of everyone who benefited from their denial. This next truth will shock you. Many empaths fear selfishness not because it is wrong, but because they unconsciously sense the ripple it will cause. They know that when they stop being the glue, others may fall apart. And here lies the tragic loyalty of the empath. They would rather collapse themselves than watch others unravel, but Jung reminds us the unconscious will demand wholeness whether we like it or not. The denied selfishness, the silenced no, the repressed anger, these will not stay hidden forever. The psyche longs for balance, and if the empath refuses to reclaim it consciously, life will force them to through burnout, illness, or breakdown. Think of it like a dam holding back a flood. For years, the empath builds stronger walls, holding in their own needs, containing everyone else's chaos. But eventually, the pressure becomes too much. The dam cracks. And when it breaks, the flood doesn't just wash over the empath, it sweeps through the entire system. Here's the part nobody talks about. The empath's liberation is not just personal healing. It is a collective earthquake. When one person in a family system refuses to carry what is not theirs, the hidden truths rise. The father must face his rage. The mother must face her avoidance. The siblings must face their neglect. The narcissist must face their emptiness. But wait, here's where it gets even deeper. This dynamic doesn't just play out in families. It plays out in entire societies. Empaths often grow up in cultures that glorify sacrifice and shame individuality. The good child is praised for obedience, while the bold child is scolded for selfishness. The empath internalizes this cultural story: to be loved, I must disappear, and so the empath becomes the quiet worker, the selfless partner, the tireless friend. They are rewarded for their silence and punished for their authenticity. Entire institutions thrive on this imbalance. Corporations profit from employees who never complain. Communities survive on volunteers who never say no. Religions exalt selflessness as virtue while warning against the dangers of pride or ego. Carl Jung would call this a collective shadow. The selfishness that society refuses to own gets projected onto those who dare to claim it. So instead, the empath absorbs the opposite role, the saint, the selfless one. But this sainthood is a prison. This next truth will shock you. The empaths denied selfishness is not just about their childhood. It is about humanity's refusal to embrace balance. The empath becomes the scapegoat for selfishness, carrying the burden of being too good so that others can remain comfortably flawed. But here's the paradox. When the empath finally stops playing this role, they don't just heal themselves. They confront the collective lie. They reveal that love without boundaries is not love at all. It is dependency. They show that selfishness, when balanced with compassion, is not destruction but truth. Let me give you another metaphor. Imagine a stage play where each actor depends on one character never speaking their lines. The whole drama works only because this one figure remains silent. But one day, that character steps forward and begins to speak. The script is ruined, but a deeper story begins. That is the empath's power. Their selfishness rewrites the story for everyone. So let's ask the hard question. What happens when the empath refuses to keep the system together? Will it collapse? Yes, but here's the hidden secret. What collapses was never real stability. It was an illusion held together by sacrifice. And sometimes illusions must fall so truth can rise, and this is the part nobody talks about. The empath's no is not just rebellion. It is creation. It creates space for real relationships, authentic choices, and honest systems. Their selfishness is not destruction, it is the seed of a new order. But wait until you hear what comes next, because reclaiming selfishness doesn't just free the empath from their family or society. It awakens a dangerous, powerful energy within them. An energy Jung called the self, the wholeness that emerges when shadow and light are integrated. And once the empath touches this power, they can never go back to silence. Let me ask you something. What if the part of you feared the most, the part you've been told is wrong, selfish, unlovable, is actually the doorway to your greatest strength? Here's the truth that nobody told you. The moment the empath embraces the right to exist for themselves, something extraordinary awakens. Carl Jung called it the self, the wholeness of who you truly are. Beyond masks, beyond roles, beyond wounds. But here's the part nobody talks about: this awakening doesn't arrive quietly. It arrives like thunder. And for those who have built their comfort on the empath's silence, this thunder is terrifying. Think of it this way. For years, the empath has walked through life like a candle in the wind, flickering, fragile, always protecting their light from being snuffed out. But the moment they reclaim selfishness, the candle transforms into a fire. A flame that doesn't just survive the wind, but shapes it. Wait until you hear this, because this is where the empath begins to feel a new kind of power. Not the manipulative power of the narcissist, not the dominating power of control, but the grounded power of authenticity. They start to realize, I am not just here to carry others. I am here to live as myself. Carl Jung described individuation, the process of becoming whole, as the great work of life. For the empath, individuation means integrating the denied shadow of selfishness, anger, and desire. And once integrated, these energies transform from destructive impulses into creative forces. The anger becomes courage. The desire becomes purpose. The selfishness becomes self-love. But here's the shocking truth: those around the empath may not celebrate this transformation. They may fear it. Why? Because when the empath awakens, the power dynamic shifts. The friend who once depended on their endless listening finds that the empath no longer entertains endless drama. The partner who once relied on their sacrifices discovers boundaries where there used to be none. The family who once leaned on their silence suddenly meets resistance, and the system quakes. Let me give you a story. Daniel was known as the good son, always agreeable, always available, always selfless. His parents leaned on him for emotional support. His siblings took advantage of his reliability. But one day, Daniel began therapy, where he learned about boundaries. Slowly, he started saying no. He began making choices for himself. To his shock, his family grew hostile. They accused him of being distant, ungrateful, selfish. But Daniel realized what they called selfishness was simply him finally existing. This is the part nobody talks about. The empath's awakening threatens the fragile illusions others have built. For the narcissist, it means the loss of supply. For the codependent family, it means confronting their own dysfunction. For society, it means a refusal to play the unpaid role of caretaker. But Jung would remind us this: resistance is not proof the empath is wrong. It is proof they are breaking through the collective shadow. Here's the paradox. The empath, once seen as fragile, now becomes the one others quietly fear. Not because they are cruel, but because they are no longer controllable. The child who was denied selfishness now walks with a presence that says, I belong to myself. This next truth will shock you. When the empath awakens, their energy changes. People sense it before words are even spoken. The same softness is there, but it is no longer available for exploitation. It radiates with clarity. Strangers may respect them more. Manipulators may avoid them. Old relationships may crumble while new, authentic ones emerge. Let's pause here. Doesn't this sound like a paradox? The empath, who once feared selfishness would make them unlovable, discovers that their boundaries actually deepen love. Because love without authenticity is dependency. And love with authenticity is freedom. But here's where Jung's insight goes deeper. The self is not just personal. It is archetypal. When the empath awakens, they don't just transform themselves, they activate something in the collective unconscious. They embody a new possibility, that compassion and selfishness can coexist. That wholeness requires both. Think of it like a tree. For years, the empath was like a tree with deep roots, but branches bound tightly with ropes. Their energy went inward, hidden, contained. But when they cut the ropes, the branches stretch wide, reaching sunlight, bearing fruit. The same tree, but finally free to live its fullness. But wait, what happens when this fullness is expressed in relationships? This is where the story gets intense. Some people will try harder to bind the branches again. They will beg, guilt, rage. Others will quietly slip away, unable to face the new reality. But the ones who stay, those are the relationships built on true respect. Here's the part nobody talks about. The empath's awakening isn't just about saying no. It's about learning a new yes. A yes to joy. A yes to pleasure. A yes to their own dreams. Because selfishness is not only about refusing others, it's about choosing oneself, and this choice is terrifying for many empaths because it feels like betrayal. But Jung would say it is not betrayal, it is individuation. It is the soul's demand for wholeness. This next truth will shock you. The empath's selfishness is actually their most spiritual act. Why? Because to deny oneself is to deny the spark of life that was given uniquely to them. To reclaim oneself is to honor that spark. Selfishness, in this sense, is not greed, it is reverence for existence. So here we stand at a turning point. The empath, once fragile, now carries a strength that unsettles others but anchors themselves. Their no becomes sacred. Their yes becomes powerful. Their energy becomes undeniable. But here's the question: what happens when the empath, in reclaiming selfishness, meets the part of themselves they've feared the most? The raw, untamed shadow. The anger. The hunger. The desires long buried. Will they be consumed by it, or will they learn to integrate it into wholeness? What if I told you that the part of yourself you've been running from your entire life isn't your enemy, but your greatest ally? What if the anger you've buried, the desires you've silenced, the selfishness you've denied are not signs of weakness or corruption, but the missing keys to your wholeness? Here's the part nobody talks about. When the empath finally allows themselves to awaken, they don't just step into light, they stumble straight into shadow. And it's not pretty. Carl Jung warned us that individuation, the journey to becoming whole, requires a descent. He called it meeting the shadow, that inner figure made of everything we've rejected, denied, or feared. For the empath, this shadow is massive because for years they have pushed so much of themselves underground. Their anger, their ambition, their desires, their selfishness. Wait until you hear this. When the empath meets their shadow for the first time, it doesn't arrive as a gentle whisper. It roars. Think about it. Imagine starving a lion for years and then finally opening the cage. What do you think happens? The lion doesn't calmly step out, it charges. That's what happens inside the empath. The suppressed parts surge forward with intensity. Suddenly, they feel anger at the people who used them. They feel rage at the years lost. They feel hunger for love, for attention, for recognition that once seemed shameful, and it terrifies them. This is the moment many empaths fear the most. They think, am I becoming the narcissist? Am I becoming the monster I swore I'd never be? But Jung would say, no, you are not becoming the shadow. You are simply seeing it. And what you see, you can integrate. But here's the truth nobody ever told you: the shadow is not evil. It is raw energy, unrefined, unchanneled, and if denied, it corrupts. But if integrated, it transforms. Let's ground this with a story. Clara was the classic caretaker. Sweet, gentle, always giving. But in her late 30s, she began to feel a strange resentment she couldn't explain. Little irritations became bursts of anger. She'd snap at friends, lash out at coworkers, then collapse into guilt. This isn't me, she thought. I'm supposed to be kind, but therapy revealed the truth. This was her. Not the false mask of kindness, but the real, neglected Clara. Her shadow was demanding to be heard. And when she finally listened, when she journaled her rage, admitted her desires, and dared to say, I want this for myself, she didn't lose her empathy. She deepened it. Because empathy that denies self is incomplete. But here's the shocking truth: the empath's shadow often looks very similar to the narcissist's surface. That's why it's so frightening. When the empath feels selfish, it feels like betrayal. When they express anger, it feels abusive. When they demand attention, it feels manipulative. But the difference is this: the narcissist lives only from shadow, cut off from empathy. The empath, when integrated, lives from wholeness. They hold both empathy and selfishness, compassion and power. This next truth will shock you. Without integrating selfishness, empathy becomes martyrdom. And martyrdom is not love, it's self-erasure. Jung would argue that love must include the self, or else it is not love at all. Think of the shadow as a mirror. The empath looks into it and sees the face they feared, the selfish child, the angry teenager, the demanding adult. But when they look closer, they realize this face isn't a monster. It's them. A younger, wounded version of them, still waiting to be accepted. Here's the part nobody talks about. Healing doesn't mean destroying the shadow. It means embracing it. The empath must look at that denied child and say, I see you. I hear you. I won't silence you anymore. This is where the transformation happens. The anger, once terrifying, becomes fuel for boundaries. The hunger, once shameful, becomes a drive for creation. The selfishness, once denied, becomes the foundation of self-love. Let me ask you something. How many times have you silenced yourself because you feared being too much, too needy, too demanding, too selfish? But what if that too much was exactly the medicine you needed? Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." For the empath, enlightenment is not about becoming more selfless, but about becoming more whole. And wholeness demands darkness, but wait, the shadow doesn't integrate overnight. At first, the empath may swing like a pendulum. One day, they are still selfless to a fault. The next, they explode with rage. One moment, they feel guilty for saying no. The next, they feel guilty for saying yes. This back and forth is natural. It is the psyche, recalibrating. Think of it like learning to walk again after years of crawling. At first, it's clumsy. But with practice, the steps become steady. And soon walking feels natural. Here's the shocking truth many empaths give up during this phase. They see their shadow erupt and think, I'm broken. I'm becoming someone else. But the reality is, they are becoming themselves for the first time. Let's return to the metaphor of the lion. When it bursts from the cage, it's wild, unpredictable, even dangerous. But with time, it can be guided, trained, honored. It becomes a protector, not a threat. The empath's shadow is the same. Once honored, it becomes the guardian of their boundaries, the fuel of their passion, the fire of their authenticity. So let me ask you, what part of yourself are you still caging? What desire are you still silencing? What anger are you still swallowing? And what would happen if, instead of fighting it, you finally allowed it to speak? Because here's the paradox: when the empath embraces selfishness, they don't lose empathy. They expand it. They learn that true compassion is not about self-erasure, but about standing whole in both light and shadow. This next truth will shock you. Many empaths discover that after integrating their shadow, they actually feel more love, not less. Why? Because they no longer resent the love they give. It flows freely, rooted in choice, not obligation. And that makes it sacred. As Jung taught, the shadow is not to be feared, it is to be befriended. And when the empath befriends theirs, they become uncheckable. But here's the question: if the empath awakens to their shadow and integrates selfishness, what happens next? What becomes of their relationships, their calling, their role in a world that once depended on their silence? What happens when the person everyone counted on to stay silent suddenly speaks? What happens when the one who always said yes dares to say no? What happens when the empath, the eternal giver, the silent healer, finally reclaims the selfishness they were taught to bury? Here's the truth nobody talks about: when the empath changes, their entire world trembles. Carl Jung warned us that individuation, the process of becoming whole, is not just an inner transformation. It has outer consequences. Because once the empath integrates their shadow, they can no longer play the same role in family, relationships, or society. They stop being the unconscious container for everyone else's pain. And trust me, that terrifies people. Let's start with relationships. For years, the empath has been the peacekeeper, the listener, the forgiver, the one who absorbed conflict instead of creating it. But when the empath finds their voice, relationships, built on imbalance, begin to crack. Imagine a marriage where one partner always takes and the other always gives. When the empath starts saying, "No, I won't carry this burden for you anymore," the taker panics. They may lash out, accuse, manipulate, or even play the victim. Why? Because the empath's growth threatens the unspoken contract. You give, I take. Here's the part nobody talks about: some relationships will not survive the empath's awakening. And that is not a tragedy. It is liberation. Because love that demands silence is not love, but wait until you hear this: the empath's transformation doesn't only threaten romantic partners. It shakes family systems too. Families often assign roles. The empath is the good child, the helper, the one who never causes trouble. They absorb chaos to keep the family functioning. But when they stop carrying that role, the entire system destabilizes. Siblings may resent them. Parents may accuse them of changing or being selfish. In truth, the empath isn't changing, they are finally becoming real. Think of it like removing the keystone from an arch. The entire structure wobbles. But that's the only way to rebuild something healthier. Here's the shocking truth: the empath's awakening often triggers narcissistic rage in those closest to them. The narcissist thrives on the empath's silence because it gives them power. But when the empath no longer feeds them, the narcissist feels exposed, weak, even desperate. This is when masks shatter. Manipulation intensifies. Gaslighting escalates. The narcissist will do anything to pull the empath back into silence, but the empath who has integrated their shadow has a new weapon: boundaries. They can now say, "I see your tactics. They no longer work on me," and that terrifies the narcissist more than anything. Now, let's zoom out. This transformation doesn't just ripple through personal relationships, it touches society. Because society loves compliant empaths. They are the workers who overgive, the friends who overlisten, the partners who oversacrifice. Entire systems benefit from their silence. Corporations profit. Religious institutions glorify their selflessness. Cultures praise their humility. But here's the part nobody talks about: when empaths stop denying selfishness, they become dangerous to systems of exploitation. They begin asking, why am I working 60 hours a week while being underpaid? Why am I expected to serve endlessly without recognition? Why am I applauded for giving everything but shamed when I ask for something back? This next truth will shock you. When an empath awakens, they often become leaders. Not because they seek power, but because they no longer fear it. The same sensitivity that once kept them silent becomes vision. The same compassion that once enslaved them becomes wisdom. And the same shadow that once frightened them becomes strength. Think of Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, or even Jung himself. Each, in their own way, embodied empathy, but not the passive, silent kind. They fused empathy with strength, compassion with power, love with boundaries. That is the awakened empath, but let's not romanticize it. The transition is messy. Many empaths lose friends, partners, jobs. They go through what Jung described as the death of the old self. It feels like destruction, but it is rebirth. Here's a story to make this real. David spent his life as the dependable one. Friends called him at midnight with problems. Coworkers dumped tasks on him. His partner leaned on him emotionally but never offered support in return. One day, David snapped. He realized he was living a life built entirely on serving others while his own dreams rotted. He began saying no. He stopped answering calls at midnight. He asked his partner for equal effort. He even turned down extra projects at work. The backlash was immediate. Friends called him selfish. His boss hinted he was no longer a team player. His partner accused him of being cold. For months, David doubted himself. But slowly, something incredible happened. New friendships emerged, friends who respected his boundaries. A new job opportunity opened, one that valued his talents. And his partner? They either had to grow or leave. Either way, David was free. This is the paradox: selfishness, when integrated, doesn't destroy relationships. It purifies them. It burns away the false and reveals the true. But here's the shocking truth: when empaths stop denying selfishness, they also transform their relationship with themselves. For the first time, they can look in the mirror and say, I am enough. I deserve to take up space. I don't have to shrink for others to shine, and that shift is revolutionary. Because once an empath values themselves, they can no longer tolerate abuse, exploitation, or manipulation. They stop being prey. They start being creators. Carl Jung believed that every individual transformation ripples through the collective unconscious. When one empath integrates their shadow, it doesn't just heal them, it heals generations. It breaks family cycles. It reshapes cultural narratives. It challenges societal structures. So let me ask you, what happens if millions of empaths awaken? What happens if millions of people who were once silent begin to speak, demand, create, and lead? Wouldn't that change everything? Here's the part nobody talks about. Society is terrified of that possibility. That's why it praises empathy but punishes selfishness. That's why it glorifies sacrifice but shames desire. Because a silent empath is useful. A selfish empath is unstoppable, and this is where Jung's final insight becomes prophecy. The empath denied selfishness is incomplete, but the empath who reclaims selfishness is whole. And wholeness is power, but wait, there's more. Because when the empath integrates selfishness, they don't just transform relationships or society, they transform their purpose. They begin to realize they weren't born to merely survive or serve. They were born to create, to lead, to shape reality itself.